Hi, Misha here, and earlier I published kind of an overview video of the various Soviet MiGs from the Generation 1 craft up through Generation 4, kind of ending with the end of the Soviet Union. And I promised then I would do a more up-close, in-depth look. And at this time I figure this will be about a 4-part series, kind of looking at each generation. And yeah. For the first generation, we have the MiG-15. This is an East German DDR piloted variant. And then also we'll look at the very similar MiG-17. And this is from the Czechoslovakian Air Force. Both are decidedly first-generation jet aircraft, although late first-generation. The early jet aircraft, first-gen, typically had straight wings or a very minor sweep to the wings. Most famously, there was the Messerschmitt's 262. There was also the Henkel HE 162, kind of the people's plane, that Nazi Germany deployed in very late World War II. Britain worked with the Gloucester Meteor, which again deployed very late in very small numbers at the end of World War II. America worked on the P-59, and then later the P-80, but these came just a little late to even go into service in World War II. Also, Japan worked with some jet aircraft, but really these didn't come to much of anything. There's also some early attempts with rocketry, such as the Messerschmitt 163, but that's a story for another day. In Russia, the Mikhail Gogorievich at the factory, the MiG, the Design Bureau, would start off producing prop planes. The MiG-1 would appear in 1940, with the MiG-3 as an interceptor version in 1941. And right after the war, they began testing jets, all kinds of different things, different kind of hybrid designs, jet designs. Really the first one to be remotely successful was the MiG-9, which first flew in 1946. It was made in very small numbers, at least by Russian standards. Only about 500, 600 of the MiG-9s were made. But that led directly to the MiG-15 we see here. This first flew in 1947 and then went into service in 1949 in Russia. And was really one of the first successful swept-wing jet designs. It was Russia's first. Honestly, this first flew just a couple months after the American F-86 Sabre, so it was very much a contemporary of that. Interestingly, the jet engine from Rolls-Royce was purchased legitimately from England after World War II. It wasn't espionage or anything like that. The government in England at the time wanted to improve Soviet relations, so they authorized the sale. And of course, Russia upgraded to their own engine for this critter. And in 1950, the MiG-15 BIS appeared as an improved version. And this is what mostly saw service in the Korean War. There's so many stories. I'm not going, you can read, there's documentaries. At first, Russian pilots flew these in secret, then Chinese pilots in 1951, and then finally Korean pilots started to fly these in relatively late 1952. As the Chinese and especially the Korean pilots started to fly these, more and more MiGs were lost. Of course, early on, 1950, this was dominating the skies of Korea. The F-86 was in very limited numbers. This thing was designed kind of initially as a fighter, bomber, and also interceptor. The idea was to shoot down things like the B-29. To that end, it really was equipped with mostly with cannon. It had two 23mm with an 80-round capacity each, and then one large 37mm with a 40-round capacity. It did have two underwing hardpoints that could be used for unguided rockets or just kind of dumb bombs, drop bombs, about 100-kilogram bombs, or fuel tanks. But primarily this was meant to be a gun plane. It was not supersonic. It could cruise at about Mach 0.6 to 0.7, and after about 0.9 it became uncontrollable. Interestingly, it's about 33 feet long and also 33 feet wide, so it's basically a square, a box. I find that amusing. I don't know why, but I do. It has a ceiling of just under 51,000 feet. And was otherwise quite a primitive, though very effective, relatively small, agile aircraft. About 20 nations would ultimately use the MiG-15. It was even produced under license in a few. And over 17,000 were built in the 1950s. However, this plane's day in the sun was pretty quickly limited, and it's not just this plane's fault. Even like the F-84 and the F-86 were quickly dated because technology was just progressing forward at such a rapid clip. In 1955, Egypt would purchase some MiG-15s along with the later MiG-17s, and they would use these in the Suez Crisis. 1958, actually, the Republic of China, Taiwan, would score the first kill with a Sidewinder and AIM missile on a MiG-15, 1958. And really by the 1960s, these were being phased out. They were out of frontline service in Russia for sure. And even Vietnam only used MiG-15s as trainers. There was a two-seat version for that purpose as well. Again, there's a lot of stories about the MiG-15 because of the Korean War. Funnily enough, North Korea still has some MiG-15s in its inventory that it uses as trainers. So it does still fly them, but it's the only one. As far as this Hobby Master model, it's basically all metal because of the design. It has a sliding cockpit that slides to the rear like the original. It has guns. It has deployable flaps and air brakes and engine intakes. You can set them to different positions. And of course, like any of these, you can set the landing gear to the down position. And it came with fuel tanks and bombs if you'd like to attach those, but I kind of like the clean look of the wings on these planes. Cool model for sure. By the way, the unfortunate Nato code name for this was Fagot. All the Russian planes would have F names, and this one received the wonderful name of Fagot. Which, you know, if you think about it, faggot in Britain, cigarette, cigar, it does. The fuselage does kind of look like a smoke. So, yeah, however it works. But a very iconic plane, one of the first successful jet fighters, swept wing design. But of course, it did have its limitations. For example, the cannon, while powerful, it had limited ammo, and of course, slower rate of fire than a machine gun. So while they were good at taking out things like bombers or even ground targets, not so good against other air jet fighter type vehicles. Also, this could become uncontrollable in a dive if the pilot wasn't careful. And it had a few other kind of aerodynamic shortcomings, which is what led to this. The MiG-17, NATO codename Fresco, much better than Fagot. Really, the outset, this was just going to be an improved version of the MiG-15, but a lot of changes were made. As I said, the 15 was introduced in 1949, and already by 1950, the prototype, what would become the MiG-17, took its first flight. The idea was basically look at the 15, see what was good about it, what needed improvement, and then introduce improvements. So yeah, the prototype flew in 1950. The first MiG-17s rolled off the production line and into service in 1952, but were just a little late to go over to Korea for that war. By the time these came out, the war was already winding down, so they did not see combat there. The first time the MiG-17 was in combat was in the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1958. And the first MiG-17s would go to Vietnam in 1960, with the first Vietnamese squadron equipped with them being established in 1964. And then most famously, probably for the MiG-17, in 1965, one of these shot down a supersonic F-105 Thunder Chief, which it did not make America happy. The MiG-17 has very similar specifications to the MiG-15. It has the same 3 cannon, 2 23mm, 1 37. Lengthwise, we're just a little bit longer. We're at 37 feet tip to tip. And our wings are now at 31 feet span because this introduced a slightly new pattern. The 15 was a sweep wing, but more or less had the same angle throughout. This was a compound sweep wing, so actually the angle changes partial way through. Actually making this slightly more narrow, but actually giving more wing surface. It really wasn't much faster. It could go about Mach 0.93 and still be controllable. It's defined as transonic. However, it was more maneuverable than the 15. It also had safer, better handling. Didn't have as many of the quirks. Those had been ironed out, thanks in part to a new tail setup, as well as those wings, and of course an improved engine. It had a higher ceiling, whereas the MiG-15 really couldn't quite make 51,000 feet. This could get up to almost 55,000. It also had an improved bomb capability. The 15 still had the 2 pylons as the 17, but the 15 could only carry 2 100-kilogram bombs. The 17 could lift 2 250-kilogram bombs, and of course, like the previous fighters, it could also be equipped with rockets, unguided missiles, fuel tanks, etc. So it had a much greater lift capability for ordnance. In 1953, or thereabouts, the MiG-17F introduced an afterburner. It was the first really to have that for Russia. And then an improved radar was introduced. And this pretty much became the quintessential Fresco variant, the 17F. While they would not make these in as great a numbers as the 15, they would make about 10,500, 10,600 total, including licensed variants. These would actually be used by more nations 25 instead of 20. So in some ways it was more successful, other ways less so. And again, this is still a first generation, although extremely late first generation jet fighter. And these would be used quite a bit in Vietnam, as well as with Egypt, as I said earlier, and Russia, China, Czechoslovakia, obviously, Poland. The usual suspects. The model itself from Hobbymaster is very similar to the 15. It again has the sliding canopy. It has the 3 guns, deployable gear. It comes with some ordnance you can attach. And of course it's a little bit larger. One final thing, the MiG-15, at least a variant of it, is infamous because in 1968, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, and also the first to orbit the Earth, was killed in one of these. So there's that. Just thought I would mention it because I have that love of the space program. I would actually love to get a Vostok or a Voskhod or a Soyuz capsule. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, the original Generation 1 MiGs used by many nations in the Com Bloc, communist era, but designed in Russia. They were relatively simple machines for a jet fighter. Had a relatively low production cost. At this point, these are both kind of designed as multi-role, I guess we would say today, fighter, interceptor, even light bombers. And had relatively limited range, especially without additional fuel tanks. And of course, were still subsonic and had limited ordnance. But they did what they needed to do. The 15 showed itself very well in Korea, and the 17 still held its own reasonably well, even in Vietnam. I love kind of the classic retro look of these. Pretty neat. I'm actually really glad that Hobbymaster did the 17. They could have easily said, it's close enough to the 15, who cares? But they didn't. And that's pretty neat. Alright guys, well I think that's about all I can ramble on this. Again, if you'd like to know more about these planes, there's several excellent documentaries and articles and even books out there, so I'm not even going to try to reproduce what's already been done better by others. So check those out. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to comment below. And next time we'll get into the second generation of MiG fighters, the 19 and the 21. This is Misha, and I'll catch you then.